Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sojourners webinar on faith, race, and immigration. My name is Jessica Cobian, and I'm the Immigration Campaign Associate for Sojourners, and I will be your facilitator for the discussion today. Our panelists today include Lisa Sharon-Harper, who will be sharing with us about theology and history of race and immigration, and Alexia Salvatierra, who will share with us about the sanctuary movement and what congregations are doing right now. So right now, we will start with Lisa Sharon-Harper, who is the Chief Church Engagement Officer and the author of the book, The Very Good Gospel. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me on this. And also thank you to all the viewers who have clicked in today in order to really kind of receive from, I'm actually mostly excited for Alexia Salvatierra, who is standing by, you can see. Let's think deeply about the theology of race and immigration, and then also how that applies to the world right now and what we can do about it. So let's jump in. I'm going to be talking particularly about the theology of race. And I'm actually, you guys, I'm sorry, I'm trying to push this thing and is going forward. Oh, there we go. All right, sorry. Oh, there we go. So the first, I want to actually share with us 3 words. Anybody who has heard me speak for like the last 13, 14 years, you've heard me speak on Shalom. And so I'm going to start my comments with that, helping us to understand the implications of the concept of Shalom and how it intersects with our system of immigration. It's a direct connection here. So at Genesis 1, which is where we ground our understanding of the concept of shalom, we see 3 words. One of them is actually a phrase that jumps out of the text and actually helps us kind of unpack the text. The first word, and actually this is the phrase, is tov me'od. So tov me'od, it comes from the verse in verse 31 in chapter 1. It's God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. So here we see very good, tov me'od. Actually, tov is good, me'od is very. Now that tov, actually, it's not the Hebrews, when they thought of goodness, they didn't think of goodness as existing inside the thing. They actually thought of goodness as existing between things. And that's really significant. That when God actually looked around at the end of the 6th day and said, this is very good, what God was talking about was the relatedness between things was very good. And that word very is not actually just talking, it's not like saying, yo, that's pretty good. Instead, actually what God is saying is, this is forcefully good. This is abundantly good. This is overwhelmingly good. So the relationship between humanity and God was forcefully good. The relatedness between men and women was forcefully good. The relatedness between all humanity and the rest of creation, forcefully good. And the relatedness between all creation and the way things worked, systems that govern us, was forcefully good. There was no cursing in Genesis 1, only blessing. All bless all. So you get it? So now that's the first word. The second word that I want to share with you is the word Shalom. So Shalom comes from verse 26. If you just jump back a little bit in the text, it means, or it comes from, then God said, let us make humankind in our image, to our likeness, right? So that's verse 26, part A. It's first part of the verse. So that word image, the word Shalom in the Hebrew, and it means representative figure. It's the same concept, or basically the ancients of the time understood the representative figure of the king on statues or on coins, and wherever that coin went in the empire was supposed to be a marker of where that king ruled. And then also, they only believed that the kings and queens bore the image of God. So that's significant, because what's happening here is the writers of this text are saying, no. God is not only born in the royalty. The image of God is born in every single human being. That means that when we look on anybody in our world, we should be seeing them with the same inherent dignity that we would usually reserve for royalty, for a king or a queen. Now, second word, or third word rather, is rada. So just, in case you didn't get it the first time, then they actually add this like really radical verse where it says, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Now that's Genesis 1:26b. That's the second part of the verse. So deal here. So that word dominion is the word rada. It means to steward. It actually doesn't mean necessarily to rule. I don't know why it just jumped forward. Let's see here. Let's go back. So thank you. Okay, so rada does not necessarily mean to rule. What it means is actually to steward, to exercise agency, to make decisions that impact the world. In fact, if you jump to Genesis 2, you get a really clear picture of rada when God places the human in the middle of the garden and says, till and keep it. Those words, till and keep, they actually mean serve and protect. So that's what rada, that's what dominion looks like. It looks like serving. It looks like protecting. Now, there are some implications to this. Let's take a look at the implications. So these implications. First, very goodness is about the overwhelming wellness of all the relationships and relatedness between all of creation. To be made in the image of God is to be made with the divine call of God and the capacity of being equal to help steward the world. To limit or crush the capacity of people or people groups to help steward the world is also to limit or crush the image of God on earth, okay? So just take that in for a minute, okay? Now let's talk about race. So we're take a quick look down the history of race, and we'll begin to understand this. The first person we want to talk about quickly is Plato. So Plato, right, he wrote this thing called the Republic back in 360 BC. And in that, he laid the foundations for the Western belief in human hierarchy, y'all. Okay, so in it, Plato explains his hierarchy, which was not actually based on color or skin, but rather Plato created a class hierarchy determined by racial categories. And those racial categories are basically delineated by the kind of metal that people were made of, okay? So some people are made of gold, others are made of silver, some are made of copper and brass, and each race was ordained by God, in his mind, to hold different stations in society, right? Gold people would serve society in this way. The silver people would serve society in that way. Now, mind you, I mean, I know I just said it was a hierarchy, but it wasn't really in the same way that we think of. He didn't say some people are more important than others, but what he did say was that some people were actually created for a particular class, a particular way to serve society. I hope that's clear. So the next person I want to jump to is the Pope. And 1454. So the Pope in 1454, he had an explorer come to him and say, yo, Pope, I want to go exploring. So I need a blessing. And so the Pope said, oh, I'll give you a blessing. And in fact, I'll give you one better. I'll give you the ability to claim land that you run across that is not civilized. Now, you know what we mean by civilized, right? So what we mean by civilized is we mean they with stone or cement or they dance, they don't really move their bodies. They kind of just move around the floor like that. That's what they call civilized, right? So when we talk about civilized, that was a misreading actually of Genesis 1, because what we know to be true in Genesis 1 is that all humanity is created to exercise dominion on the earth, not just those who dance in space like that, right? So that's the Pope, and that's where we get North America, South America, Central America. That's where we get almost all of colonized Africa. That's where we get Australia, New Zealand. The colonized world came from that edict. Then we're going to flash forward to, if I can flash forward, there we go. We're going to flash forward to Linnaeus. So Linnaeus was this botanist. Now, you guys probably know Linnaeus from Kingdom, Class, Order, Genus, Species. Yes, I still remember that from 7th grade. Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. So, but what Linnaeus did was he created this Systema Naturale. Fauna. He classified fauna. Well, one day he got a brilliant idea and he said, well, this might work with humanity. Let's try it out. So what he did was he created a hierarchy of humanity. Put people who look like himself on top, and under that he put other people. And so what it was basically, he said, a white Europeanus goes on top. Under that is red Americanus. Under that is yellow Asiatus. And on the very bottom, he put black Africanus, y'all. Yes, he did. I saw the paper myself. So there you go. So that is Linnaeus. Now, flash forward just 40 years, and you get the 3/5 compromise. Now, this bad science has been codified into law. And what that 3/5 compromise did was it actually said that the northern states demanded that, the southern states demanded that they be able to count their slaves in the number of people that would go towards the number of congressional representatives they would have in Congress. This is kind of the first gerrymandering. Hello, somebody. The northern states didn't want to count black folks at all, so don't even think the northerners get off well right here. But that was the 3/5 compromise. So anybody who was of African descent and enslaved in the South was counted as 3/5 of a human being. In other words, not a full human being. So why is this significant? Well, it's significant because here we are now codified in law as less than human. And the very first census comes around in just 3 years later in 1790. And on the very first census, there's only one race, that's white. And then the same year, you get the Immigration Act of 1790. And in the Immigration Act of 1790, it is declared that only white men who are free can become naturalized citizens. Now, why would they do that? Why would they reserve naturalization for only white men? Well, it's a question of dominion, because only people who can become naturalized can vote. Hello? So even back then, in the founding of our nation, what we did was we established a racial hierarchy of human being. We basically declared by law that only people who are fully human are white men. So for the next century, we see immigrants coming into the United States. And as they come into the U.S., they are fighting their way all the way up to the Supreme Court in order to prove that they are not less than human, that they are fully human, that they are called by God to exercise stewardship of the world. In other words, that they are white for the next century. And so now, of course, you have a lot of, because now people who are not white are now deemed less than human, you also get a lot of fear-based legislation and anti-immigrant rhetoric. They're tried and true tactics dating back to the 18th century, specifically 1798, when our second president, John Adams, passed this Alien and Sedition Act to expunge foreigners. Why? Because he wanted to gerrymander the district, and that's exactly what he did. So then you go forward, and you get the Civil War. And at the end of the Civil War in 1865, you get discovery of gold. And with the discovery of gold in 1848, actually not the end of the end of the Civil War is 1865, and then also the discovery of gold in 1848. Both of those things led to two legislative landmarks in the 19th century. And one of those landmarks was the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state or on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? So that's the first one. And the second one is the Naturalization Act of 1870. In the same year, passage of the Naturalization Act of 1870 granted citizenship to people of African descent after the Civil War. For the first time, the U.S. extended citizenship beyond white men to men of African descent, but the act explicitly excluded Asians from citizenship, okay? Now, check out why or how that happened, and actually what the result of it was. Now, as you get the anti-Chinese riots of 1877 in San Francisco, you get, actually, just take a look at this, right? So you get this picture gives you kind of a window into the times. There was a guy there at the time. His name was Dennis Kearney. Oh, did I go past Dennis Kearney? Yeah. So Dennis Kearney, he was an Irish immigrant who became a major voice of the anti-Chinese movement and a leader of the Working Man's Party. Is that familiar? A white nationalist party. In 1877, Kearney thundered before the party, "The Chinese laborer is a curse to our land, is degrading to our morals, is a menace to our lives, and should be restricted and forever abolished, and the Chinese must go." That is what he said in 1877. So, why did I just show that? Well, it's because we have a history of scapegoating particular ethnic groups, particularly when particular classes of people feel threatened in America, especially white men. So the Chinese Exclusion Act came in 1882, and with that, you basically had the exclusion of a particular ethnic group law for the first time in American history. Well, the first time since the Civil War. So here you have political posturing, but the thing is, we know that God is the one who commanded humanity to fill the earth. So that the whole earth would know this is where God rules everywhere. So here on the first page of the Bible, we have the right to migrate, established by God. And actually the call established by God. So check this out. Consider this. Where the image of the king flourished in the ancient mind, kingdom flourished. Where images of the king were destroyed, he knew there was war in that land. So when we govern, the implication here theologically is when we govern in a way that crushes the image of God, we are setting ourselves up as enemies of the kingdom of God. We are declaring war against God. Now, what would it look like for us to lay down our arms? God? What would it look like to honor the right of every human being to migrate in U.S. law? To exercise dominion in a way that reflects God's kind of dominion. The kind of dominion that cultivates and protects. The kind of dominion that lifts up the image of God in all of us. That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you for the powerful message, Lisa. Now we will hear from Reverend Alexia Salvatierra, who's the co-author of Faith-Rooted Organizing, Mobilizing the Church in Service to the World. Hi, Alexia, and welcome to our webinar.
Hi, thank you, Jessica. I need control over this here so that I can do my slides. Thank you. So I'm here to talk about the sanctuary movement, but the sanctuary movement actually is an interfaith movement to protect and defend vulnerable immigrants. I'm also going to talk about Matthew 25, which is a bipartisan Christian movement with the same goal that works together intimately with the sanctuary movement. So I'm really talking about both. Who needs protection and defense at this particular moment in history? When people ask me, what is it about illegal you don't understand? My response is, that's a good question, but what is it about cruel and unusual punishment that you don't understand? The immigration system we have right now, at this moment in history, is practicing cruel and unusual punishment. Let me clarify just a little bit about what I mean. Another question that people ask me all the time in congregations is, why don't people just stand in line? Because many people believe that if anyone can immigrate to this country, can pursue the American dream if they're just willing to wait. Well, that was our grandparents' immigration system, at least many of our grandparents, maybe not all of our grandparents' immigration system, but that's no longer true. There are very few categories through which you can apply to come to this country. The three major categories are work. If you're an American employer, you can petition for someone from another country if you can prove that an American citizen doesn't want the job, and only up to certain limits or caps. Secondly, family. If you are intimate family with somebody from another country, you can petition for them, but there are many problems with this category as well. And then the third category goes all the way back to the end of World War II, and it's the category for refugees or people asking for political asylum. By the way, that's essentially the same category. The difference is only that if you're asking for it from a refugee center in another country, that's refugee status. If you're asking for it at the border, that's asylum status. But it's all about people that are fleeing unjust persecution in their home country as a result of their religion, race, or some other similar category. Well, those are the three, but none of them are working as intended. Most people in this country know that our immigration system isn't effective, that it just doesn't work. If you get a step closer, you'll find out that it's profoundly illogical, that it makes the DMV and the IRS look positively sane in comparison. And if you get a step closer than that, you know that it's profoundly inhumane. We have had bipartisan efforts in 2007 and 2013, completely bipartisan, to produce bills to fix this broken system. When we poll on those proposed bills, we get about 75% support. But we haven't had the political will to pass them, because the average American does not call your congressperson about something that doesn't have to do personally with you. And immigration does not have personally to do with enough people for people to call. So the people who call over and over and over again are the people who think that undocumented immigrants are the problem, and they call over and over and over. So we have not had the political will to pass these bills, but instead what we've done is that we have created a regulatory safety net to recognize the contributions of immigrants and to soften some of the worst aspects of the broken system. We call one aspect of that net the prioritization of enforcement. It means that you don't give the same amount of attention to the detention and deportation of someone who may be considered a threat to public safety as you do to someone who really is contributing to our country, but is just running into this buzzsaw of a broken system. So that you give certain people, like the young people that many of you may have heard of, the dreamers, you give them a right to stay in this country until we can fix the system, being checked every year, renewing that right every year. It's called a stay removal. Well, that system, that regulatory system, has recently been shredded. So just let me give you one example of what that means on the ground. We have a pastor who is an Assemblies of God pastor with a thriving ministry. He's married to a U.S. citizen. He has 2 U.S. citizen children, but he received a deportation order 25 years ago when, as a teenager, he came to this country to work. He was deported, and now he's a deportation order. And a deportation order can only be removed by the judge who gave the order, nobody else. And that judge has retired. It was 25 years ago. So you can't remove the deportation order, so his qualifying cases of his wife, of his work, can be looked at. So he has had a stay of removal every year while we're waiting to fix this broken system. But now the new administration is planning to deport him. He's one, of course, of many, many people, hundreds of thousands of people in that situation as a result of the executive orders. What do the executive orders say that caused that situation? Well, the the new administration claims that their priority is the deportation of bad hombres, people who have committed crimes. But they have changed the definition of a crime. So under the Obama administration in the last 2 years, 90% of the people deported had felonies. Now a crime is any crime, misdemeanor, felony, traffic violation, traffic ticket, infraction. It's also a crime that someone has been accused of but not convicted. So wait a minute, you may be saying, wait a minute, the Bill of Rights, right? Innocent until proven guilty, well, not for immigrants. Someone has been accused but not convicted. And even if they have not been accused, if the person has just committed what the ICE agent on the ground thinks is a chargeable offense, that's good enough. And it actually goes even farther than that. They admitted recently in the Los Angeles area, they picked up and deported about 161 people, excuse me. And they turned over the information to legislators that showed that a quarter of those people had never even had a traffic infraction. So, you know, their only crime was having either entered the country without complete immigration documents or overstaying a visa. That was their only crime. So you can see that there is no more prioritization of enforcement, essentially. So someone like this pastor I was talking about is in exactly the same position as a human trafficker or a drug trafficker. The other little note that I have at the bottom here that I just want to mention quickly is we have a number of unaccompanied children and youth who have come fleeing an absolute human rights horror in Central America. And those children and youth have been sponsored often by people from their extended families, because the government doesn't provide money for sponsors for unaccompanied children. They just ask for people to sponsor them. So it's members of their family. But now the administration has said that if the person who is sponsoring an unaccompanied child takes them to court and that person doesn't have full immigration documents, that person will be detained and deported. So now how are these children going to get to court? And if they miss a court date, that's an automatic deportation order without looking at whether or not they would be violently attacked if they went back to their home country. So that's the inhumanity of the system at this particular point in history. How do we respond as the church? First of all, I want to talk about our advocacy response. How do we influence the decisions of public decision makers? Because brothers and sisters, ultimately, this can only change if the immigration system changes. And that's a set of federal public decisions. And the only way that enough people around this country are going to understand that and are going to care about it is if we let people know what's going on. There are two different news feeds in this country, and those of us who know what's happening with immigrant families are not receiving the same news as those of us who don't. But the church crosses those lines. So we really need to send the stories. If we know the stories, if we know the truth about what's happening in the system, we really need to send those stories to our brothers and sisters, to our networks, to our families who live on the other side of the line, who receive a newsfeed that does not give them this information. There are also lawsuits going on, and those lawsuits need your stories and need your examples and need your testimonies. So those are ways to change federal public decisions. In the meantime, we can also work. Immigration is a federal issue, but states do have some role, and various states are working on various pieces of legislation. Please find out what's going on in your state. Most of that legislation is around non-compliance, which means that the state law enforcement on a local and state level is not enforcing immigration law. And that's very important because it allows people that are undocumented to be witnesses of crimes, or if they are victims of crimes, to seek legal help, which they couldn't do if people who are in law enforcement are enforcing immigration law. So it's important, and those are going on. Then there's city and county public decisions. Cities and counties are coming up with legal funds to defend people who are suffering cruel and unusual punishment. That's something you can certainly help make happen. Some cities are doing civil rights legislation, which keeps landlords and businesses from using ICE to be able to exploit people, because people are afraid to complain. So that would stop that. So those kinds of decisions are happening on a local level. And then ICE regional decisions. We are rebuilding in Southern California a family commission, which works to stop the separation of families, with conservative legislators involved as well as progressive legislators. And we're going to be meeting with our ICE director behind the scenes and trying to move them more towards a prioritization of enforcement, because they do have some level of authority regionally. So these are all different ways that you can advocate. I just want to spark some ideas. Look for who's doing it in your area. There are often coalitions of immigrant rights leaders, of lawyers, immigration lawyers who are working on these issues, and you can support them. And the church can make a big difference. So that's one way. The second way is family support. So there's advocacy and there's family support. Under family support, number one, we have preparing families for this, to deal with this situation. So family plans have to do with describing in writing, in a way that's legally notarized, what you want to happen to your children if you're deported, if you're undocumented. And churches can also have the power of attorney to pick up kids so that kids don't end up in the foster care system, and to get them to whoever the parents have designated. So that's a family plan. Packets, you can do stay removal packets. They're called deferred deportation packets that help people to collect the evidence that they would need to apply for the regulatory system if we can get it back. You can teach people to know their rights. You know, we do have certain rights, even immigrants. You can remain silent. You may want to make sure that people have letters from a lawyer so they can hand the letter from the lawyer to the person who's questioning them, because otherwise it can be pretty scary to remain silent. But that's an option that you can do. We also need to provide trauma support. People are very traumatized right now without knowing who's going to be picked up, when they're going to be picked up. We have citizen children that cannot concentrate in school, that cannot do well in their studies because they're so traumatized. We have children whose parents have been deported, and all of these people need our ministry. So preparing families. Secondly, we can do what's called individual or family campaigns. That if you know a particular family where a member is likely to be deported, they've been detained, you can step out there and write letters of support. You can hold prayer vigils outside the detention center. You can get media. You can get some public pressure that sometimes can keep them from deporting that person. There's two ways you can find out about those families. There are rapid response networks growing in every city, again, with immigrant rights and immigration lawyers leading them, that allow you to find out about people in that situation who, you know, call into the network. There's also, we're doing in Southern California, a matching service. We're in the last stages of pulling it together, which will match immigrant and non-immigrant congregations, primarily immigrant, primarily non-immigrant, so that the primarily immigrant congregation can bring the stories of the people in that congregation who are in that situation to the non-immigrant congregation, and we can set up partnerships to accompany families and to advocate for them in the system. So that's another way to find that out. You can always provide support for legal defense. We have a lot of amazing immigration lawyers who are offering pro bono, low bono, but there's a limit to how much they can do that. They need to live, they need to pay their rent. So we really do need to, and legal services are very time consuming and expensive. So we really need to be part of providing legal defense support. And lastly, we do have the option of providing what's called private or public sanctuary. And I'm going to give you some more detail about that, because I know that that's what lots of people are most interested in. But I do want to underline that all of this is important, that sanctuary is sexy, you know, and it's important, but all of this is important. So you may want to do some of these other activities as well. Although what I want to say before I get to sanctuary is that it's essential to do this, if at all possible, in collaboration between immigrant and non-immigrant congregations. You know, when the world knows that Jesus has come, John 17:21, because of the unity of his followers, it's not just talking about Baptists and Methodists getting together. The world doesn't care if Baptists and Methodists get together, but if immigrants and non-immigrants are working together in just peer partnerships, then the world says, wow, something different is happening here. And we really need to be part of that, because we each bring different strengths to this process of accompanying families and defending these families. So let me talk a little bit about sanctuary. The roots of sanctuary are biblical. They go back to Numbers 35. Let's read this together. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, select some towns to be your cities of refuge, to which a person who has killed someone accidentally may flee. They will be places of refuge from the avenger, so that anyone accused of murder may not die before they stand trial before the assembly. The situation was that someone who had committed manslaughter, who had killed someone accidentally, was subject to the exact same law that somebody was who had committed murder, which was a life for a life. That if you had murdered, you were to die. So God thinks that you shouldn't die it's a cruel and unusual punishment. You shouldn't die if you've killed someone accidentally. So God instructs the people of God to create places of refuge where people can stay until they can get a fair hearing. It's God's remedy for an unjust crime. God's remedy for an unjust response to a crime, protection until there can be a fair hearing. So that's where the sanctuary concept comes from. Of course, it has been used in secular contexts as well as faith-based contexts now. In Los Angeles since 1979, we've had Special Order 40, where the police don't enforce immigration law. And I talked a little bit about that earlier. You know, just to give you a sense of what happens when they do, in Texas, we had a woman going to court who was a victim of domestic violence and was going to testify against her abuser. And he called ICE and she was picked up at court before she could testify. So how many people do you think in Texas are now going to be willing to go to court and testify against domestic violence? So it's very critical in order for law enforcement to work in beneficial ways for all of our communities in effective ways, that it's very important to have this separation. Well, that's essentially what sanctuary means, is that firewall, that non-compliance between local law enforcement and, on a municipal level, local law enforcement and federal law enforcement. So that's what a sanctuary city is a city where municipal resources are not used to do federal immigration enforcement. There are many of them. There are about 500 counties. There are 6 states, I think, and over 40 cities around the country. So this is not just a West Coast, East Coast phenomenon. Then, although I do want to say that not everybody uses the word sanctuary, the term sanctuary actually has no public legal meaning. So there are cities saying that they're sanctuaries and not doing non-compliance, and there are cities doing non-compliance that are not using the word sanctuary. So just important to recognize that. But that's essentially what it means on a public level. Now let me go back to the church, and I want to talk a little bit about previous sanctuary movements because I want you to understand why this makes a difference. So the first major sanctuary movement in the US that has to do with immigrants, some people use the concept of sanctuary dealing with the Underground Railroad during slavery, but the first major sanctuary movement that had to do with immigrants was in 1980. It was the Central American Sanctuary Movement. The history is that there were wars, civil wars going on in Central America for many years. In Guatemala, it was 30 years. In El Salvador, it was 16 years before it ended. These were essentially land reform wars. When the war started in El Salvador, 14 families owned 90% of the land as a result of Spanish land grants. So there was an uprising of the people who lived and worked the land and had to turn over so much of their produce of the crop that they couldn't feed their children. So there was a natural uprising. One might have thought that the US would have taken the side of the people who were involved in that uprising, but the Secretary of State at the time was the brother of the head of United Fruit, so we took the side of the 14 families. And it was during the Cold War, so of course Russia took the side of the revolution, even though it was not a communist revolution at the time. And liberation theology had just come along. And so the Catholic Church, large sectors of the Catholic Church, who had always taken the side of the families, instead took the side of the people who were working on land reform. As a result, the 14 families and their armies went after the church, and there was a major persecution of the church. So many of us know about Archbishop Oscar Romero being shot on the altar. What most people don't know is that if you were carrying a Bible openly in public, because you were on your way to be a catechist for a base Christian community Bible study, that you could be disappeared. So over that time period, over about a 10-year period, 500,000 people fled the Northern Triangle of Central America for the United States. And when they got to this country, they sought political asylum. They were natural political asylum recipients, except that we had a little problem, which is that we had two completely different standards for receiving political asylum for people running from countries that were our ally or countries that were our opponent. If you were running from Russia or Cuba, you could be a ballet dancer wanting to defect and you could have political asylum. If you were running from Guatemala, even though we had footage, we had documentary footage from Amnesty International showing that people were getting off the planes from deportation and being shot at the airport, only 5% of Guatemaltecos got political asylum during that time period because the bar was so high. So they called out, because they were Christians, they called out to the churches and they called out to us on the basis of Numbers 35 and asked for sanctuary. And there was a sanctuary movement. There were about 500 churches involved. And what happened was that we were successful. We were very influential in changing the asylum system so that now it's the same criteria for anybody coming from anywhere in the world. And we were instrumental in stopping the funding for the civil wars. And when we stopped the funding for the governments in the civil wars, peace happened in every single country within a couple of years. And not one country became a communist country. So the rhetoric of the Reagan administration that they would all become communist if we weren't supporting those families just wasn't true. Anyhow, the power, what was instrumental? What was the power in what we did? Well, when non-immigrants were willing to suffer, to risk, to sacrifice in order to stand with immigrant brothers and sisters and to amplify their voices so that everyone could hear their voices, then people's public perceptions changed. And they were willing to look at the situation again, not just accept blindly what the administration was saying. So that act of solidarity was enormously politically powerful. Act of solidarity and partnership was tremendously politically powerful. We were charged, we were infiltrated, there was a grand jury trial, but we won the trial. There was only one person who was incarcerated, and she was incarcerated not for breaking the harboring laws, but for breaking transportation laws. She had transported someone across the state line. That was the only person who was convicted, because the argument was that we were being faithful to our national treaty, which was part of the international treaty that to provide asylum and to provide refuge. So that was that sanctuary movement. In 2005, the Sensenbrenner bill passed the House, which would have made it a felony to be undocumented or to help or serve an undocumented person. And it was written very loosely so that that service could be baptism, it could be emergency food. So of course, people who had been here many years as a result, without full legal status as a result of our immigration system, freaked out. There was waves of, terror and grief and anger and of course in the faith community, people who were serving those folks, there were also waves of confusion and fear and what are we going to do? Well, and how are we going to respond? Well, in March of 2006, Cardinal Mahoney, who was the Archbishop of Los Angeles, preached a sermon on Ash Wednesday, calling on Catholics all over the country to continue ministering to anybody, regardless of their immigration status, even if we were to go to prison. Well, that was that kind of step, right, of somebody who was not an immigrant being willing to risk and suffer and sacrifice in solidarity with immigrants that, again, amplified the voices of immigrants, allowed people to change people's perspective. And we thought, a number of us, okay, it's time for another sanctuary movement. And we started the new sanctuary movement. And again, we were successful in a couple of important ways. One way is Sensenbrenner did not pass the Senate. That was important. But beyond that, even though we did not achieve comprehensive immigration reform, we were able to achieve the kind of regulatory reforms that I was talking about. We were able to create a prioritization of enforcement, and we are also able to create something called sensitive zones, which means that ICE themselves recognizes that they will not enter a church, they will not enter a school, they will not enter a hospital unless they have a judicial warrant against a specific person who has committed a specific serious crime. So that was progress. The legal argument for sanctuary, which we never actually had to use, we have never had a church brought to court yet around sanctuary and the new sanctuary movement, although it is always possible given the current administration. But the argument has been the separation of church and state, which means that we do have a right to minister to people, all kinds of people, if that's what our doctrine says. And also that we are not harboring, because harboring is concealing someone for the purpose of furthering the illegal stay in the country. And we are not concealing them, we are openly sheltering them. We proclaim sanctuary. And secondly, we are not trying to further their continuing illegal presence. We're trying to help them gain a legal presence. So those have been the legal arguments that our lawyers have come up with. We haven't yet had them tested. So if you're interested in offering sanctuary, there's a couple things you need to know. One of them is that you can offer private sanctuary, which is short-term protection for assessment or resettlement. That is not illegal as long as it is just people helping people. You know, I can say, all right, you can, churches offer hospitality, you can have hospitality in the church, you can have hospitality in a private home, but, you know, we're not calling this sanctuary, we're not telling the press, we're not, you know, I'm just caring for my neighbor, neighbor to neighbor, Christian to Christian, Christian to person in need, right? So, but it's temporary, you know, it doesn't make any difference to have somebody stay with you for years. It doesn't help their situation. They just need to figure out what they're going to do next if they're in a direct situation of danger. Then there's long-term public sanctuary, which is about changing hearts and minds. It's not just about serving people, it's about changing hearts and minds in the way we've talked about. What you need in order to do long-term sanctuary well is that the person who's going to be in sanctuary or the family needs a revelatory story. They need a story that really communicates very well what is going on with this broken system. So you have to think about that, whatever that means to you. You need legal support. It's ideal to have a potential exit strategy, although at this point that's very hard to do, given the issues around the shredding of the regulatory system. But you know, if it's not, you need to be honest that if there is no potential exit strategy, that person is going to be inside that church for years. It's a form of house arrest. And you just need to be very clear about that that's what it is. You need a coalition of supporting churches because you can't handle the financial aspects of keeping a family inside your church for years if you don't have some kind of help. Although we are trying to look at ways that we can start small businesses for these families and maybe even connect them. But so far, we really have to look at how the churches can support. Churches also often have to provide security and pastoral care. So you need a coalition of churches, not just one church. Then you need a media strategy, because if you're going to change hearts and minds, you got to be able to publicize it. That's social media and traditional media. One major resource for folks who want to do sanctuary is the site sanctuarynotdeportation.org, and that is the site of the new sanctuary movement. And that's where people get together and share best practices. So important to realize that. Matthew 25 is the Matthew 25 pledge. If you want to get involved with Matthew 25, but we're all doing the same work together. It's just interfaith work or bipartisan Christian work, but we're all doing the same work. So last slide is just, this is the information from ICE about the sensitive locations. So we had a situation recently where ICE was in a parking lot of a church, and people who came out used this information to make them leave. So it's important to know that this is ICE's current policy, even under the new administration, is to respect sensitive locations. So thank you.
Thank you, Alexia. Hello? Can you all hear me?
We can hear you, Jessica.
Yeah. Yes.
There's been a little feedback on all of us.
can't click on my slide. Okay. Now we'll do a brief legislative update on the relevant policies affecting immigrants and how to get involved. Thank you. So currently there are 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the US. And from January 22nd to April 29th, ICE arrested 41,318 people on civil immigration charges. And this is in comparison to last year during the same period that ICE arrested 30,028 individuals. So this reflects an increase of 37% from last year to this year. And also nearly 11,000 people were also detained with no criminal convictions and were arrested during that same period of time, compared to the 4,242 from last year. So we're seeing a lot of increase on ICE activity, and it's causing a lot of fear in our communities of color. A lot of people are afraid of just, driving their kids to school, driving their kids to church. And sadly, this is only the beginning of the increase in the activities of ICE. So recently, Congress passed the FY 2017 spending bill, and it will be funding the government through September. And even though they did not fund Trump's wall, it did include $1.5 billion to change CBP hiring practices. And it also included to further develop technology and surveillance along the southern border, and to maintain and expand existing wall and fencing. It also included 5,000 additional beds in immigration detention centers, and it eliminated the congressional immigrant quota, which requires DHS to maintain no fewer than 34,000 beds in immigrant detention. And currently, the Trump administration is also influencing the congressional agenda's effort to increase the criminalization of undocumented immigrants. For example, the David Oliver SAFE Act, which was introduced by House Member Labrador, is modeled after the racist Arizona SB 1070. And if passed, this legislation would allow local law enforcement to act as ICE, and it would aim at criminalizing faith leaders and allies who harbor anyone whose immigrant status has lapsed. This legislation will be heard for the second time today. And here at Sojourners, we're also working on the reunification of families through legislation such as the Bridge Act. This legislation was introduced in the House by Congressmember Kaufman and in the Senate by Graham and Durbin. This is a bipartisan bill, and it will provide provisional protected presence and a work authorization for eligible young immigrants. And if passed, it would also allow DACA recipients to continue to live in the US. We're also anticipating a reintroduction of a DREAM Act, which some of you know, it offered a pathway to legal status for young students here in the US. But note that neither of these bills, if passed, would actually offer a comprehensive solution to our broken immigration system. These are only short-term fixes for a specific group of people. So basically, the rest of the 1 million undocumented folks would have to go and wait in line. But what does that mean, right? So what does it mean when people say, okay, people that don't have, a legal status need to go to the back of the line? So on the next slide, we will see what it means to actually go to the back of the line. And as we can see, it's a very intricate pathway, and it's not as easy as everyone else says. And in the blue, it shows us that if a person is trying to file for citizenship through a spouse, the total ideal time to wait will be 6 to 7 years. And if you're trying to petition for a green card through a sibling, the best case scenario would be 12 to 28 years. So that's still a long line. And this chart is actually from 2011. So during the new year, it has actually become an even more complex process. And I think on the bottom of the chart, it talks about the H-1B visa. And now it's the H-1B visa is even harder to attain. So we believe that right now we need more of a comprehensive bill. And we would like to urge everyone to take action by signing the Matthew 25 pledge, which was mentioned before. And on the 25 pledge, which will, there you go. On this great resource, you will get all the information that you need in order to get your congregations involved. It also teaches you about emergency support, the local safety nets, how to prepare and discern for this ministry that you would have. And it's a great toolkit which you will get once you sign the Matthew 25 pledge. And here on this next slide. Well, so, and we also want to urge you to reach out to your Congress members through the Constituent Advocacy 101. And if we can click on the Constituent Advocacy 101, it's a great toolkit, and it teaches you everything from how to call your Congress member's office, how to schedule a meeting, how to prepare a testimony, how to do a follow-up. So this is also on our website on sojo.net. And we will also write this information down on our resource slide. So on our next slide, we will also show the contact of myself, of Alexia, of Lisa. If you have any other questions or you would like to just contact us, please feel free to share this slide. And also stay in touch with sojo.net as we have new and upcoming webinars. So I would like to thank Lisa and Alexia for being part of this webinar. Thank you so much for this important information. And thank you to all of our viewers. And we will also share this slide. Thank you.